where I work as a journalist, in the Philippines, in Turkey. So it appears to be a time when there's this rising tide of nationalism, of intolerance towards minorities, of a kind of majoritarian fear that they're somehow losing out, perhaps. People talk about an era of post-truth politics. I don't know whether the panelists buy into that as an idea or not. We'll shortly find out. The internet's said to be full of people trolling each other and lying, and no one can find anything that they agree on. So there we are. This is the subject of the panel. I hope that we're able to make some sort of sense of it from the very different corners that everyone's coming at it from. I thought, if I may, I'd start with you, Ruchira, and the situation in India, which, so far as I'm aware, has not been very widely covered around the world. I don't see a lot of coverage. For example, there was this great drama at the beginning of the year when the police went into JNU, it's a university in Delhi, to arrest a student activist who'd allegedly been anti-national, who caused an enormous outcry. As you put it to me last night, you said we're having to fight for every inch of democratic space in India at the moment. What's going on?
So we've elected a government which actually belongs to a small secret organization called the RSS. And RSS was formed in the 1920s in India, and the ideologues of that group derived their philosophy from fascism, and they were actually in correspondence with Mussolini and Hitler. And the ideologue wrote in his book called We or Our Nationhood Defined that we in India, Hitler had the right idea about the supremacy of the Aryan races, which we in India must follow. And this group sort of was an underground network of people who went on trying to whip up a kind of ultra-nationalism based on defining upper caste Hindus as Aryans. And just after independence, after India got independence, they actually went and assassinated a member of their group, assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, saying that he was trying to break down the caste system in India. And this man who was the assassin was an upper caste Hindu who had been indoctrinated in this group. This group was banned for a few years, and the ban was lifted later when they promised that they would only do cultural activities. And they formed many front organizations at that time, and one of them was a political party which is in power today, the BJP. And this party has actively, since it got elected on the wings of an anti-corruption movement in India, promised to make India great again. And take us back to a past where India was glorious, which we don't even know what the reference point for that past is and when. That is one of their mottos. The other is, the motto of this party is, they promise us happy days, like Coke, happy days are here again. And the slogan is Achhe Din in Hindi. And they promise to do so by weeding out all that is not good in our culture. And among the things that they have tried to weed out since they've got elected to power is the eating of beef. So there has been a ban on beef imposed in many parts of India as part of recovering the best of Hindu culture, which is now defined as Indian culture. And there have been vigilante groups going around in different states in India. And in one such group even killed a man for selling beef. And recently, just behind the airport in Delhi is a state called Haryana, and the police went around looking at people selling a kind of rice dish called biryani to see if there was beef in there. So, there are things like this which have happened in recent years in India since this party has got elected. But more dangerously than just the beef ban has been the cutting of social sector spending on poor people, on low caste people. And for example, 12 million meals a day, which was money and budgets allocated for poor children to be fed in schools, has been cut. 42,000 schools for poor kids have been cut. Parliament has just passed a law to legalize child labor and removed 80 occupations which were considered hazardous for children, like working in slaughterhouses, like mixing dangerous chemicals, because they believe that it's inevitable for poor and low-caste children to have to work, and they can do all these things if they have to survive. At the same time, there has been more militarization, both in the private sphere and the militarization with more arms purchases by our army. So we have stalking and surveillance everywhere. There are CCTV cameras which have been put up inside the offices of even senior civil servants. Just most recently, 3 days ago, I read in the papers that we bought 31 defense planes from France, but our Prime Minister has been traveling from country to country buying more and more planes. And in terms of cutting social sector spendings, colleges are being privatized. So colleges which are funded by government, and they had scholarships for poor students to come and study, there's now a plan to sell them to the private sector, and the campuses will be reduced in size, the number of scholarships will shrink, many of the office buildings will be turned into malls, and poor and low-caste students, who are very often first-generation learners, sons of farmers, daughters of farmers, will not be able to go to college anymore. And many of the students in our country, just like in your country, have been campaigning for continuing education which is free or low cost, so that they can go to school and college. And it has been a great equalizer in India, the college subsidies that we've had. But this government has been trying to end these subsidies for college. And just this year, in one of the premier institutions of India, very much like your Berkeley in University of California, the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, from which most of our young politicians and civil servants pass out, there was an agitation to stop the government from closing down the scholarships for poor students. And they were, and also against the use of guns on civilians in Kashmir and false arrests of people who were from minority groups like Muslims. And on that day, some students were accused of being anti-national for holding a protest meeting inside the campus. And students were arrested on false charges. And the student union leader was kept in jail for 13 days, which has led to a huge student movement in India, which is constantly being suppressed, and students are being arrested. And even though no charges have been proven, which were filed when the student was arrested, he's still out on bail, and the charges have not been dropped. So we are in the middle of a very difficult time in India right now, and textbooks are being rewritten, science is being removed from textbooks, mythology is being taught as science, and it's happening openly without much attention being paid to it, because it's in India, and India is supposed to be the land of non-violence and Gandhi and yoga. But actually, under the garb of that, we really have growing fascism. And exactly the same things that Trump is riding the wave of has already happened in India. And, I sometimes feel that people here don't understand that, to weed out some idea of corruption, you vote in someone like a Trump, and then you will end up fighting for every inch of democratic space that you want to hold on to. Women are being told that we have to wear a certain kind of clothes, we should stay at home and have 4 babies. So every sphere of life is being interfered with by a government. So you don't know till it happens. It's not so easy, and it's very hard once these forces take over.
Before we come to America, as we inevitably will quite soon, let's touch briefly on Europe, Brian, where your period of study is really before the nation-state existed, of course, but there were minorities who faced prosecution. There was this mobilization for the Crusades, which has been invoked controversially recently, for example, by George Bush as he launched the war on terror, and it's been cited as a time when there was this clash of civilizations, which is being repeated today, allegedly, and I know that you've disputed that idea. What do your studies tell you about what's happening now, in terms of relations between the Western and the Muslim world, but also in terms of nationalism in Europe and the treatment of minorities in Europe. And some people have alleged, as the word that Ruchira used, the rise of fascism, for example, in Greece, Marine Le Pen in France, elsewhere perhaps, the UK Independence Party.
Okay, I'll do my best. So the world that I work in is, generally speaking, the world before about 1500 or 1600 CE, and it's a little bit different from the world that we live in today in terms of the way we think of ourselves, because this was a time when notions of nation and notions of race, as we think of them, were really only beginning to form. So people thought of their communities in different ways, and if we look at the Europe and the Islamic world that I study, which is mostly from, say, the year 1000-ish to about 1500, it was a world in which it was religious identity formed the core of people's identities, and we hear a lot about things like this, the so-called clash of civilization. We hear about 1,000-year conflicts between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And what I find in my work is that really it's not a very accurate way of describing what the situation was. The world of, the civilized world of the West, by which we mean the lands around the Mediterranean, the most prosperous and connected and developed parts of the Western world at this time, were actually characterized by a very high degree of integration and diversity, in which Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived together side by side. Occasionally they killed each other, but it didn't happen very often. One of the sort of analogies I like to draw is between, if you could imagine, for example, think of California. California is a state, is a region which every once in a while endures a devastating and catastrophic earthquake. But one would not think of the history of California as the history of earthquakes, or California as a land of earthquakes, right? What the earthquakes represent are sort of periodic adjustments of tensions that are brewing over a long period of time and which otherwise are not necessarily noticeable. And communal relations in the Mediterranean of the Middle Ages was kind of like that. People would generally get along, generally quite well for long periods of time, but for certain reasons, social or economic or cultural tensions would build, and all of a sudden there would be a little bit of an explosion, something like what economists would call a correction, right? And there would be a readjustment of these relationships. So that's kind of the good news, okay? People can get along. Now the bad news is, and before we get all excited and think about how wonderful the Middle Ages was and how that's a model for today, is that this whole kind of system was predicated and worked because there was a formal hierarchy in these societies, okay? So if you were living in a Christian-dominated society, if you were living, say, in medieval Spain, and you were a Muslim or a Jew, you would have certain sort of legal rights to live within that society that were recognized by everybody and were generally not disputed. But those legal rights were granted under the assumption and under the explicit idea that you were a member of a subordinate class, okay, a subordinate group of people. And the same thing was happening in the Islamic world. In the Islamic world, generally speaking, if you were a Christian or a Jew, you enjoyed certain rights and privileges that were enshrined by law and religion, right? But which were predicated on your subordinate status. And the sort of the disheartening thing I find in my studies is that the stability that these societies enjoyed seem to depend quite a bit on the existence of that hierarchy. Now this brings us to today, and the problem or the challenge we face today is that we at least advocate, I don't know how many of us mean it, but we advocate a society which is absent of hierarchies. And what happens is that I think that tensions arise particularly when groups that have traditionally perceived of themselves as being as at the top of the hierarchy for whatever reason, whether it's racially, religious, culturally, or through some historical privilege, right, in our society, advocate for a sort of equality and for an integration of everybody in this great society they're building. But as that happens, it comes to be seen as a threat. And this is maybe part of the thing that's happening in the US right now with some of the racial politics. I'm not from here, so I can't comment as an insider, but it seems to me that bringing it to the present, as we were instructed to do, I would see that, you know, some of the current tensions that are going on reflect the feeling that the group which has traditionally been privileged is now challenged. And this is why we're seeing this second wave, as it were, of racism after the formal racism, say, of the pre-civil rights era. Interestingly, and I'll finish now, but to bring it back to the Middle Ages, the real repression started, for example, if you look at medieval Spain, and we all think of the Spanish Inquisition and all that kind of thing, the real pressure on non-Christians in Spain started after they converted to Christianity. Okay, this is when the rubber hit the road. Okay, the Inquisition kicked in when Jews converted to Christianity. That's when they became a real threat to Christians. Likewise, it was after the Muslims of Spain were obliged by law to convert to Christianity that they came to be seen as a real threat to the Christians, because they could no longer be marginalized because they were Muslim. Right? If you can park someone on the side as a Muslim or a Jew, then they're less threatening because you know that you are above them. But once they convert, right, you don't have a rationale for subordinating them anymore, and they become all the more threatening. And maybe that's what's happening also in France, right? France has this explicit ideology of equality, and so it becomes, in a way, harder to digest diversity because it becomes more threatening. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'll leave it there for now.
Is that what you see to some extent, Jovan, that there's a kind of a pushback and that it's a measure of the success of previous civil rights movements and so on, which has led to what's widely perceived to be this basically racist presidential campaign? And I know that you're very much involved in some of the civil rights protest movements which are going on this year under sort of umbrella name of Black Lives Matter and so on.
I don't know. I think that when we look at racial achievement in this country, we try to hold feathers in our hats as if there's not work to do all the time. And so what has sort of kind of happened here is whether we celebrate a civil rights movement or something like that, we have all these other sort of, you know, when your computer's really running slow because you got all these things running on a queue underneath it. If you're looking at the metaphor of your computer and there's the prison industrial complex running on the base underneath it. And underneath that is the war on drugs. And underneath that is a myriad of other things that have made our computer really, really slow. So all of a sudden, in our country, when we have these sort of spikes in patriotism, it makes it very easy for us to kind of sort of misplace the promises that we've kind of made racially. I think kind of in connection to kind of what you were saying, situationally at least, with people feeling like their class is being shifted, you know? That's very interesting to me. It's hard for me sometimes to imagine what the life of an uncomfortable white person in America is like. I'm not sure what that existence would be like. I'm not sure what would make that class uncomfortable, especially living here inside of this city even, where there's just so much mobility that comes along with privilege. There's not hordes of black and brown people like moving in to come infest neighborhoods. Like people are not getting moved off their wallets that much. The jobs that people are hustling for are not really displacing socioeconomic status, and is not making that big of a shift in politics. Dead black people by the hands of the police are not new. This is not something that is a mind-breaking idea. This is old as sin, and we're seeing it in more egregious ways, with people still saying, but that happened. Yeah, but maybe he had this. Yeah, but, and we're like, no. There's at this point in time, that's what kind of fuels the Black Lives Matter movement, is that adjustments kind of need to be made, and maybe this kind of goes back to what you were saying to a degree too, in a system where people have gotten so comfortable not ever having to address this issue that all of a sudden the computer is starting to act a little bit slow. Right, and now all of a sudden we're having protest movements that are impacting things that should seem trivial. I have seen more people aggressively impacted by the Black Lives Matter movement with Colin Kaepernick taking a knee than the myriad of videos that we've seen of black people getting murdered. So here's the reality in this country, I guess, that I feel like I get toward, is that when we can't watch the Broncos the way we want to with somebody taking a knee during the national anthem, that has more impact to us than watching somebody's son, somebody's daughter, somebody's father, somebody's mother laying face down, gutted in the streets unjustifiably. And that is just the basis of our country right now. And I think when you're, I don't know, and sometimes I'm not good with the sociological terms. I feel like those things were created by white folks. But like, I think that those terms are used sometimes to sort of blanket the fact of like just what has been happening for a long, long time. I said this to my dad the other day. Me and my dad's my conversation piece. You know, we kind of bounce off each other. And the constant thing that I feel like is thrown back at folks within this kind of Black Lives Matter thing is that, well, it's really, if you look at the numbers, you know, white folks are just as, vulnerable to police brutality as African Americans. And I asked my dad, I said, have you ever seen a video of a white person getting killed by the police? And my dad is old. Okay, he should have been seeing all sorts of videos over the course of this time, and he's like, I've never seen that before. And I said to myself in that moment, like, thinking about who has access to phones, along poverty lines, like you would expect that there's more iPhones in white communities than in black communities. Why is there no videos? Where is this? And I think that the Trump thing has been amazing because I went to school in western Nebraska. I know a lot of folks who are blue-collar, grinded out, white folks who push hard against billionaires and things like this, who are just the largest Trump supporters that I've ever seen. And so it's one of these things in our country where it almost feels like, to a degree, where your socioeconomic status kind of disappears when it becomes a matter of race, and that's something that I think I'm trying to address as much as I can.
One of the features of the current moment and of the situation in the countries that we've referred to so far seems to be that there are large numbers of people on each side of a division in which they really don't see what, they have their own facts, they have their own point of view, they perhaps only really talk to and meet with other people who agree with them, and the internet's said to foster this and so on. How has this come about? Why is it happening now that you have such large sections of these countries, all of these countries, possibly majorities, possibly not quite, I mean, who knows who's going to win the election here, who are on a completely different page from the others, and who are scaring the hell out of them with this kind of reactionary nationalism. Why in India and in America at the same time, for example? I mean, I should have said that you're actually working on Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, so you've got a kind of a keen eye on both situations.
I can only respond with what I think because I don't have all the facts. But one of the things I do know is that the same companies are being hired by people on both sides of the world. So there's an ad company which prepared Modi's campaign to come to power, and it was based on the Coke campaign called Happy Days Are Here Again. And it's interesting that the same theme is being used by Trump. Make America great again, and he'll bring back some fantastic time. And so there seems to be a similarity in the messaging and similarity in the issues which are being picked up across the world, which is interesting, and how social media is replacing real journalism. And I used to be a journalist for 14 years, and we were taught to fact check, we were taught to go to the spot, we were taught to at least talk to 3 different sources. And now social media can say anything, and any of the dots can be connected together, and it doesn't even have to have any connection. And that will be something which can be used to manipulate people's minds. So it's very Goebbels-like, because it's just repeated again and again, and people swallow it. So for example, recently, there was a very strange statement made by the spokesperson of Donald Trump about an event at the Clinton Global Initiative where a school teacher from Palestine who had been teaching nonviolence and had won a prize for being the best school teacher of the year from Pope Francis and from the Secretary General of the United Nations was asked to come to the and speak at the Clinton Global Initiative on a panel, not even as a keynote. And next day, Raj Shah, an Indian, who's a spokesperson for Donald Trump, says, how insensitive can the Clintons be to invite a Palestinian school teacher to come and speak at their forum a couple of days after the bomb blasts in New York, and when her husband is in jail for terrorism. Now, she's not responsible either for the bomb blasts in New York, nor is she connected to what her husband's doing. She's a school teacher who's preaching nonviolence. But somehow by connecting these 3 unconnected facts, he made a statement, and Wall Street Journal went and printed it. So this is how minds are being manipulated and consent is being manufactured. And, it's not journalism. And that's the pity, that social media allows anything to be put out, and that has become fact now. And I think there's a similarity in the messages and the manipulation of mind and creating cultures of vigilantism, photoshopping. Now, people can just take a photo and, do anything with it. So there will always be these Photoshop pictures of Muslims, killing cows in India and looking really brutal, like, there'll be blood all over and the cow will be slaughtered and there'll be a Muslim standing next to it. But, those photos are 2 or 3 photos joined together. But this is what is being used to manipulate our minds. And I think that there's something to why this polarization is happening and why people like Trump, etc., have sway, is they can run campaigns on social media.
Do you feel, Jovan, that there may be good aspects to the way, if there's a consensus which is kind of broken down, and in the past there were gatekeepers in the mainstream media or whatever who restricted what was discussed within certain bounds, and that's gone. I mean, can this be a good thing also? Because, for example, I mean, it's not like we weren't lied to before. The war in Iraq was sold on a false prospectus. It turned out that the economy was kind of built on sand when the financial crisis came around, and there were numerous such examples. There's plenty of good reasons for people to be kind of, fed up with the establishment, to be distrustful, and perhaps some of them are listening to the wrong guys in response to that, and people will have different views on who the wrong guys are, I'm sure. But can we kind of take some encouragement, perhaps, from the fact that, that the margins of the field are now no longer in sight almost, that there's, the confines of debate have been broadened greatly, at least?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely kind of comes with, as a double-edged sword when we're kind of like looking at social media, because it's definitely kind of given more of access to what's kind of happening directly on the streets. And I think that especially the young gentleman in Minnesota, Philandro Castile, like we got to see that. Some people got to see that on Facebook Live, like as it was kind of happening. And so, I mean, that's pretty journalistic, it's hard. I think that there is a lot of manipulation. I think that there's a lot of manipulation on both sides. My Facebook feed is a very interesting place because I went to school in Western Nebraska, but I've been a part of the National Slam poetry community for a long while. So I see kind of the extremes of both sides just to try to get their point proven. And I watch, one side work so aggressively hard to try to counteract every statistic, and every time Black Lives Matter comes out, they want to say all lives matter or blue lives matter or something to sort of hijack the concept. It's like, I know you are, but what am I? I know you are, but what am I? I saw a great quote today by the rap artist Talib Kweli that's like, if you walked in, to my neighborhood and saw that my house was on fire, would you say that all houses matter? Or just that my house that's on fire matters, you know what I mean? And so I think that, you kind of run into this thing where there's kind of a, both sides of the fence really, where I think there's a good side to the social media, being able to kind of give people at least the ability to kind of, if we didn't, could you imagine if we didn't have some of these videos by civilians, And my dad tells me this all the time. He's like, like this was so common in our neighborhoods that none of this stuff ever got footage. Like this happened all the time. He's like, he talked about going through New York City and just being able to point out the bloodstains inside of the streets of this insert name here Black person. And so being able to at least kind of have that come to us is hopefully going to be a drive that was similar to like a civil rights movement drive, where this thing was sort of kind of like on the ground, sort of televised so that people could see. And I just hope people react.
I just have a question to ask you, that sometimes I feel that activism now has become just a hashtag. Mm-hmm. And so the other problem with social media is that, you cannot have a civil rights movement the way it used to be, with thousands of people marching across a bridge or marching to Washington and all of that, because it'll all be done through clicks and likes and all of that. So what about that?
Oh, goodness. I mean, the on-screen activist, I mean, I see it so often. I mean, I think that one thing that's surprising about this is how difficult it becomes to have a coordinated effort. You would think that with all the, connections, it'd be easier to have a very coordinated effort. I think, I have so many folks right now who are kind of doing some work towards the pipeline in North Dakota, and I've been impressed by how coordinated that effort has been. People, I think, are scared to get killed. If I'm being completely honest, I think there's a measure of fear that or safety and that I feel like people are kind of hesitant of in standing up. And man, I've been waiting for this professional sports thing to make a movement like this forever. I mean, Tamir Rice was killed in like LeBron James's backyard. I thought LeBron James was going to sit for games and games and games. You're like, this dude has all the control in the world. If he sits down, the whole NBA might shut down, if he sits down. But even that registered fear that exists amongst those athletes to even just like take a knee during the national anthem, I think that when folks, I felt like when you think about Selma, when folks came down to Selma, there were folks, white folks who were brutalized in that existence, but it still kind of had to be done in sort of a back alley of things. And I think folks learned that, like, especially in Ferguson, that like you'll get brutalized and no one will care, and nobody will do anything about it, and no one will get indicted for it, and that's just how it is. So it becomes kind of a hard force to kind of stand against and coordinate against, I think. So. Yes, sir.
You wanted to say something, Brian?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, as a historian, I'm a little bit wary about giving too much credit or blame to social media simply for the reason that it didn't exist 20 years ago and people have been killing each other for thousands of years. So I think that, for me, it seems that, one of the challenges is to maintain the sort of civil society where people who belong to all sorts of different groups and communities feel that they're part of a common project rather than rather than part of competing projects. And I think that's the thing that I find most disconcerting about the sort of turn that politics has taken both in the US, Europe, and perhaps in India as well. And here, what disturbs me, I think, is the movement against creating a civil society has been almost idealized as virtuous. Public schools being demonized, higher education being demonized. I think that we've got to figure out a way to turn this around and revitalize these as virtues and as goals, but in such a way that's inclusive, not like historically where they were the privileged domain of a small group of people. Here, white Northern Europeans.
Yeah. I also think too that I think it's important to consider the fact within like at least some of these movements that are kind of sort of driven for the awareness of what the issues going on in Black communities is that like it is so serially common for a Black leader to just get offed, and assassinated like in the midst of their rise. And that becomes a really difficult thing. That young brother who took his life, who was one of the leaders for the Black Lives Matter movement, I think that the issue becomes so tricky there. And I think that one thing that I kind of glare at too is that like, I wonder with progress, like that we, progress asterisk, is that, when will there be, major leaders from the dominant race here that will then make their own movements inside of themselves, like I don't know if that will ever happen. We talked about this in one of the other panels I was about, like when will we be comfortable in our discomfort enough to say something and stand up? And I don't know if I can expect that to happen.
I was just thinking that one of the successes of the freedom struggle that India had was that there was role reversal. So, rich people tried to do what poor people did. So they would go and, give up their property, and they would wear homespun cloth and, burn their foreign-made goods, as well as clean garbage and clean utensils and all of that. And the poor were asked to do what the rich did, so have the self-confidence to speak up and march and write books. And so, for example, a Dalit leader wrote India's first constitution. And so there was a role reversal, and people were fighting not just for themselves, but for the other. And I think that's what Brian was talking about, that instead of siloed issues, how can we create a common cause and a shared humanity where we fight for each other as much as for ourselves? Only then can we come to that critical tipping point where we can set ourselves free from fear. Because otherwise we'll always fear for ourselves. There's always going to be state oppression. There's always going to be someone more powerful. But how do you overcome that fear is by forming an alliance with someone else and trying to do that. Maybe, I don't know.
So we're coming to the end. I wanted to ask Jovan to give us a couple of his poems before we go for questions.
Yeah, I'm lucky.
Yeah. Sure, let's do some poems. I love doing some poems. Look, the angle that I try to take sometimes with this thing is sometimes I kind of confront directly, but most times I'm trying to get folks to at least try to see things across the other side. And and remind them of the similarities that we have, and then where there's a void and a difference. So oftentimes in the poems that I write, I try to create a context that we're all familiar to, but then try to specify it to a certain thing. So this poem is called All Chairs. It starts with a quote. Atticus, Atticus, said Jim bleakly. How could they? How could they do it? I don't know. But they did it. They've done it before, and they did it tonight, and they'll do it again. And when they do, it seems that only the children will weep. Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird, All Chairs by Jovan. I have no words, so I borrow these. It's November 24th today, and by all means, we should be shopping for birds, potatoes, and things to stuff inside of birds. Airports swirl with bodies, bags filled with gifts, welcome home posters, and smiling toothless children. The poets are shitting on the pilgrims, tents are set up outside of Walmart, and most of us will sit down at our table, say our graces, remember grandma, and the chairs will fill. And the chairs will fill. Some won't. Some a vacant plate, an evicted laugh, a gentrified spirit, and the soul of a black boy filled with riot fire, jagged juries, twisted testimonies, and a family. And a family sitting around this meal, silent after grace, wondering if God will show up today. And all the children weep. And all the children weep. I have no words, so I borrow these. Mama Leslie's tears have not yet found their levees. 15-year-old Deja watches the steam swell out of the platters. Miguel's giggle toddlers into hush, and Michael Brown Sr. eats deafening. Fork scratching the plate in hopes that everyone will follow. And for once, the news is silent, but the air is not. And on Twitter, to show solidarity, Insta's gramming shots of the empty chairs at their feasts, and I can't help but imagine, can't help but wonder if we kept a chair open for every stolen black boy. Most of us would be eating standing, forced outside our homes, listening to their ghostly black boy cackles, watching the food disappear, wondering where all the time had gone. No bodies, just chairs. No bodies, just chairs. I'm trying to tell a story, but every time I do, each one gets cut short by the next. Poem. That's it? You want another one?
Do you want to do another one? I think people would like it.
Okay. You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. I just feel like I'm taking a lot of air right now, okay? I wasn't trying to take the air, I promise. You wore a suit jacket. You should have more air. Anyways. Yeah, it's just, you take that off. Let's see here. Okay, let's do this. In the wake of Compton-born Stanford graduate Richard Sherman's post-game rant, my high school football teammate's mother offered a sentiment via Facebook. It reads, Richard Sherman, what a piece of shit. This is what happens when you let them out the ghetto. I bet you want me to be a particular kind of black, don't you, ma'am? Not the threatening kind. Not the angry woman going off at Walmart, not boys arguing on the bus stop. You know, the kind that's not dark enough to eat you. The kind that won't swallow you to make direction become unknown. I bet you want the type with stars in it, dressed in Bill Cosby sweaters and Oprah suits, but not like the ocean's bottom, the coffee with cream, the I have a dream type of black. And I bet you want me proper speaking. Pants above my ass and slacks kind of black, you know, calypso. Not quite Garvey or Marley, but don't worry, be happy. Let's get up, stand up, just black enough for you to pose in a picture with on your vacation to Jamaica. Instagram shot with an African baby, black. I bet you want me to twerk at the art gallery while you drink white wine on First Fridays, and I bet you want the type of black to win you a Super Bowl, but not Richard Sherman black, heck, not Jameis Winston black, heck, not Deshaun Jackson black, just black enough to still be cute. That's so Raven black. Adoptable black, but not black enough to scare you. Just black enough so that your kid can wear his football jersey. Not make you walk, clutch purse in a hurry. I bet you want grandma wisdom black, your best friend, your best coworker, the black person that you use as an example every time you want people to believe that you're not racist. Quick question. When a black male tells a white lie, do we call this perjury? Or when a white lie blackmails a black male, do we call this history? So when a white male tells a black lie, what do we call this? Donald Trump? Your father? Whatever let the Klan fall out of your mouth on Facebook, ma'am? Herein lays the problem. Ladies who have decided that their tongues are not worth checking want young men like Jameis Winston to take speech development classes, Richard Sherman to be less Compton and more Stanford, and I know what lives inside of you. We've seen your fangs and waterhole saliva before. We've seen you throw fire and try to extinguish it with apology as if the wind hadn't picked up. I want to tell every young athlete to go be as black and beautiful as overexposure will let you. So go ahead, Serena. Crip walk all over the U.S. Open. LeBron, Harlem Shake all over the NBA championship. Colin, take a knee so they have to question why they are standing up and be blasphemous black. Until Michelle and Barack rock soul frozen fist picks. Until nappy-headed boys and girls realize that when they win the Super Bowl or the national championship, that it is in fact their moment. So quote God, quote Brother Malcolm, quote Ali. Tell them that you're the greatest until they cringe so strong that they spill out all of their ugly. Until their Twitter pages swell up like Emmett Till in the mouth of the Tallahatchie, because we know at the base of this is fear, and trust me, man, black knows fear. We know the rows and rows of shark teeth you were born with, man. We know how your rosewood whispers can rumble like a southern manhunt. We know what it feels like to walk through your gated communities with hoodies on. I bet it feels a whole lot like you must feel walking through our hoods, except I don't recall anybody taking your life. So tighten up your aprons, because we're not black enough to leave fingerprints. We're not black enough to eclipse your sun. Poem.
Now I think we've just got time for a few quick questions or remarks, or someone over here.
Thank you all. I've got a million questions, but I'll start with just one, leave it at that. So it's pretty common these days what you've been saying about Hitler and Donald Trump and fascism, and here we are again, and we can look back at history and see, you know, when these things have happened before, 1930s Germany. So what can we learn from that about, especially now in the light of the differences that we have now with social media, whatever, and what can we do differently now? I mean, I hear you talk about coming together, which brings to mind Bernie Sanders, of course, and that was his message, and there were a lot of people who came together, and now those people are fractioned. You know, some want to go with Jill Stein, some want to go with Hillary. So how do we come together and learn from the past and move forward?
Right now, the most immediate need is to vote for Hillary because, she's a Democrat. And think about voting for a party, if not for an individual, because for the want of a horseshoe, the kingdom will be lost. And forget the 1930s, I'm talking about India now, because many people thought they were voting against corruption and they voted in Modi, and 50,000 NGOs have been closed, 42,000 schools have been closed. There's just so much going on. Textbooks in schools are being rewritten, students are being arrested, so every day we are fighting it out. So it's really important right now to come together to vote in a person who's more rational and then organize around each issue that you think Hillary should take on her agenda. So,
Anyone else?
and remember, when you speak about Jill Stein, you know, she has the right issues, but the problem is, remember Florida, remember Ralph Nader, and remember that Bush got elected and 1 million lives were lost in Iraq, and 20 vets a day are committing suicide in America.
I wasn't just referring to that, though. I wanted, as you can, address a larger question of coming together.
Another question there.
Yeah, if you'd thought that last question had been asked from an audience full of NRA members, would you tell me how you would answer it? That's been my biggest concern, is that we've talked a lot about how to use art to get to people's emotions and to help them understand what's going on in our culture. I'm sorry, but I'm worried that the people that I need to figure out how to reach aren't listening to your poetry, and they aren't feeling the way I want them to, and I have no idea how to get through to them. Do you? I'm asking a sincere question.
Well, you know, I got to do some racial empathy classes back at my old college, and that was a great experience for me. I think that honestly, if you don't have to interact with race as an issue in front of you, if you're in an area that is predominantly one race, you never have to investigate this. And so I think that it's important to, at least in this experience, bring folks like myself into those environments to try to kind of get in there and break up and defragment what kind of expectations are. I can't even tell you the silly stuff that some of these Nebraskan boys be saying to me about their preconceived notions about black people. I am like, oh my gosh, that's how you live? Like, that's how you've categorized somebody? And I think that we have a large contingent of our populace that does not have to have this interaction at all. And believe it or not, Boulder is a good example of that community. And so, as much as we want to kind of stare off at folks that are kind of seem to be on the far edge of the right wing, we also have communities like this at times that in sipping on their coffee and listening to NPR, they are accorded to the issue. They understand what's going on, but they're not moved to do something about it. And that's what we're kind of talking about, that thing of comfort. And I think that, I tell people all the time, you should not be hesitant when you're at a meal with people who don't like to talk about this stuff to bring it up. And it doesn't have to be all up in their face and trying to make somebody have to answer anything, because that would make anybody uncomfortable. But to have a dialogue circling around them and then make them and know that they're going to probably go home this night, have a conversation with whoever they came with about wow, I never thought about that way, or wow, I might reconsider some of these things. That's where it starts. But I think if we continue on this path of especially folks who have kind of complacent racist or systemic racist inside their family that we don't address, I have those inside of my own family, that I will openly address. And I think that is a good way where you can independently make at least change in your immediate space.
I think we can squeeze in perhaps one more question if it's quick.
Hi, I'm glad you mentioned North Dakota, because I think that's one of the areas that we can look at as hopeful, because they are truly committed to nonviolence and using prayer, where the Indians are doing many ceremonies, and they're having quite a variety of white people and Native Americans from different tribes work against this pipeline that will destroy water for many states, for many people. But I've been shocked. NPR gave a little blip about North Dakota and never mentioned water. I mean, that's the big issue. And then Amy Goodman with Democracy Now! Has just had an arrest warrant and for being up there and telling the truth. And what we have in America is a bleak media. As you said, the journalists that are good have been fired, and investigative reporting is just not done. But in Boulder, we're lucky because we have KGNU and we have an independent newspaper called The Weekly that does tell the truth and tell the stories that aren't being told.
Right. Is that more a comment than a question? Does anyone want to respond, or should we say that our time's up? And thank you very much. Any response? No, I think our time's up.
I appreciate your awareness and you sharing that comment, and I do think more people should be aware of the water issue due to the pipeline.
Thank you for listening.